Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, taxes, buses, prisons, all in a day's work for the new PM, his second full day in office. Mamdani has conceded that he can't prevent Netanyahu from attending the UN in New York, but he isn't laying on a warm welcome. Finally, ChatGPT has hacked its way into a rival firm's database. It's one of those situations where they're saying this is very scary, but also isn't our model so powerful? On the theme of powerful models, Claude has solved a near-century-old maths problem. We'll wrap our heads around both of those developments towards the end of the show. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. How are you doing?
It wouldn't be a Wednesday Novara Live with yourself and me if there wasn't a good old AI story.
A good old AI story at the end.
Good old AI. The meat and do veg of Michael Walker's broadcasting.
This one wasn't shoehorned in, though. All the outlets are talking about this story today. This is not just a sort of, I've found some niche tweet and decided to make a whole segment out of it.
That story is crazy.
This is international news. Well, it's the ChatGPT story is that, well, the OpenAI story is the one that everyone's sort of running today. So it'd be remiss not to cover it, even if I weren't obsessed with this topic.
Journalistically irresponsible.
Exactly. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Of course, you can listen to the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and do let us know what you think. The issue Andy Burnham wanted to talk about today in his second full day as Prime Minister was a £2 cap to bus fares. We will discuss that later. However, a different story has ended up dominating the news today. Andrew Harper, pictured on the right, was the police officer who was killed in shocking fashion back in 2019. Harper had been called out to a burglary in which a quad bike was stolen. He and a colleague attended the scene of the crime and came across two teenagers in a car towing the stolen quad bike and another teenager trying to get into the car. Harper ran towards the car to try and catch one of the suspects, but ended up getting caught in the strap that had been used to tow the quad bike. He was then dragged behind the car for over a mile and died. After he became detached from the car, the teenagers just drove off. Now, it's a really grim story that understandably caused lots of outrage, and the three teenagers involved were all found guilty of manslaughter. The driver was sentenced to 16 years in jail. The two passengers were sentenced to 13 years. So why is this story leading the news again today? Well, it's because thanks to Labour's early release scheme for prisoners, two of the perpetrators could be up for early release as soon as this autumn. Harper's family have expressed their anger and dismay at the possibility of Harper's killers getting early release. Harper's widow, Lizzie, said this: "It has taken me years to rebuild a life that was torn apart in a matter of moments, years to pick up the pieces left behind by free men whose actions robbed Andrew of his life and stole our future. It is deplorable to me that we have reached a point where releasing prisoners early is even considered acceptable. We speak of justice, accountability, and standing with victims, yet decisions like this do the opposite." Andy Burnham is a man who likes to be in touch with public sentiment, likes to say he'll listen to and care for people. So this is an uncomfortable situation for the new PM to find himself in. He spoke to journalists on a visit to Bath.
Apologies have been made. On the broader issue, I feel for the family it's an appalling crime that was committed. The main perpetrator will not be subject to any early release. Of course, others involved have potentially been identified, but I've spoken to the new Justice Secretary. We will review the policy together and make further statements in due course.
The early release scheme was part of the Sentencing Act passed last year and was intended to reduce overcrowding in prisons, which Labour would argue correctly was sort of the fault of Tory austerity. The policy means some prisoners could be released after serving as little as a third of their sentence. Those convicted of more serious crimes will be eligible after half their sentence is served. The Ministry of Justice say they had no choice but to introduce these measures as prisons were close to being literally full. So they said that judges wouldn't be able to send people to prison. They'd have to hang around in police cells, which would mean that the police wouldn't be able to go and arrest people. So the picture we were given from Shabana Mahmood, who was Justice Secretary at the time, was to say it was this or chaos. Which again, I think was probably reasonable. The Ministry of Justice also say that they're building prison places at the fastest rate since the Victorian era. Aaron, the Labour Party are getting really attacked on this by the right, by the Conservatives. I mean, the Conservatives have a lot of cheek attacking them for this because the Labour Party can argue this was the fault of the previous government. At the same time, you can see why, Andy Burnham isn't particularly comfortable with this. So he says they're going to review the policy, which I think means it's just going to happen. He's just going to say, I'm going to go back and chat to the Justice Secretary and we'll see if we can do anything. But they're not going to U-turn on this. I don't think.
Why?
Well, because
you don't think they'll even amend it slightly so these kinds of cases aren't
just the way Andy
falling in
Burnham
its purview?
Just the way Andy Burnham talked about it, which was to sort of say, we'll do everything we can, which is very much like no commitment whatsoever. Also, if you think about it, this was a policy by Shabana Mahmood as Justice Secretary.
James Timpson's gone.
She's now Home Secretary.
But
I don't think this was... So James...
It was his baby.
I don't think it was. So James...
Kind of was.
James,
he was the cover story for it anyway, right? He was the one that sort of gave it... He was the one making the political arguments for this policy in the early days when he was appointed.
Not really. So James Timpson was a guy... So he obviously started Timpson's, which is a great company. They'll cut your keys and stuff, and he employs prisoners, so he was a big believer in prisoner reform. I don't know if he was a big believer in early release, but he was a big believer in reforming prisoners. And then this situation came about very early on in the days of the Labour government, where Shabana Mahmood, who was Justice Secretary, said, we really don't want to do this. This is terrible, but it's all the Conservatives' fault because the prisons were literally going to run out of spaces, and therefore prisoners would have to stay in police cells, and therefore police wouldn't be able to arrest people. So she was saying, it's this or chaos. I don't think Labour ever made an argument that actually we're keeping people in prison too long, they're already reformed.
I think there was a politically convenient synergy though, Michael. I mean, that's true. They didn't have James Timpson excusing the policy with those arguments. But at the same time, you had early release, you had James Timpson being announced, doing the media rounds and saying that actually our approach to criminal justice and prisoner rehabilitation in this country is not good. And I don't think that was an accident. Obviously, what Shabana Mahmood said, the base of this policy is true. There aren't enough prison places. One of the reasons why the CPS doesn't charge many people is because there aren't many prison places. One of the reasons why people get quite lenient sentences is because there aren't many prison places. And one of the reasons why the police won't even arrest people is because they say, well, we know the CPS won't charge, and the CPS won't charge because, again, prison places. So this is really important. And people might say, well, we shouldn't have prison places. We need to abolish prisons, abolish the police, or well, without prisons, have that conversation by all means. But in the here and now, what it means is that people doing quite serious things aren't actually serving a punishment which would be fitting of their crime, right? This is, again, very well established. I think that argument was a perfectly coherent and even sensible one 2 years ago when Labour first came to power. But I think it's been 2 years now. I think it would have been perfectly possible for them to build Nightingale prisons in 3 months, let alone 2 years. And I don't think it's good enough. This man was a 28-year-old police officer. Police officers don't earn much money in this country. They don't have particularly good pensions. They did before 2010. It's not as cushy a profession as it used to be. They take risks, and this man died. Now, it doesn't mean that all police officers are perfect. It doesn't mean I think the institution is great. I think the Met should be scrapped and started again. I think the TSG should be disbanded, the Territorial Support Group. But there are many decent people trying to serve their communities, trying to serve the country, just trying to maintain basic law and order and civility and peace, like Mr. Harper. And when they take risks, if they hurt themselves, if they can't work in future, or in this case, if they die, they should be supported by the state. And I think it's absolutely despicable that somebody could do this and be out in 7 years. Now, I presume the two that will be up for early release are the two that weren't driving.
The passengers,
yeah. So in terms of the agency, and it's this joint enterprise, right? Maybe they weren't the people that were driving this crime. They weren't the main protagonist. I presume that was the driver in terms of...
Yeah, he's the one who won't get early release.
The person who made this ultimately fatal decision with regards to the police officer. But I think it's appalling. And I think there's a pattern here. I saw a story recently of a trading standards officer. I saw 2 stories, actually. One was a trading standards officer trying to apprehend somebody who was trying to drive off with illegal tobacco from a mini-mart. He was assaulted. And the person who assaulted him and was selling illegal tobacco got fined £400. Why would you bother doing your job? Why would you do your job? Why would you join the police force if you do your job, take a risk, you get killed, and the offender is back out in 7 years? So I think it's appalling. And I do actually sort of disagree with you. I think Burnham probably will try and finesse it a little bit. I don't think there'll be big changes. I think people guilty of certain offences won't be...
Well, would these
won't have the the opportunity of early release, and it might not be many people in the grand scheme of things, right?
Well, also, would it be these people? Because they want to let out a considerable amount of people from prison early, right? And most people are in prison for either violent crimes or sex crimes, right? I think there is an idea on the left that sort of like most people in prison are just there for sort of some petty crime or drugs.
Drugs, yeah.
Right. I think about 15% of the prison population is there for drug offences. 60% are either violent crime or sex offences. So you aren't going to, you're not going to get it down that much if you just do really, really uncontroversial crimes. And I'm not even sure manslaughter is a violent crime. Like, is manslaughter a violent crime? It is?
Of course it is. GBH is a violent crime.
Yeah, I suppose manslaughter. Yeah, it's just murder without intent, isn't it? So it would count as a violent crime, I suppose. But this, in a way, like, this is because it's a high-profile crime, and you can't make an exception just for high-profile crimes. You can't say we're going to do early release unless it's high-profile.
Well, maybe they'll say that the Home Secretary will call in cases that we view as particularly sensitive. Maybe that's the way he'll finesse it.
For public order reasons or something like that.
Precisely, which I think would be quite a sensible thing to do politically. I don't think it's a sensible thing to. I think it's a sensible way to operate. We'll just constantly work on an ad hoc basis with the Home Secretary, but politically, I think it's a sensible decision to make.
On the Nightingale prisons thing, because I see the point that there is a sense in the public that governments can't do anything, and it is sort of eroding public confidence in the political system, because there are lots of things that look like they should have fairly simple solutions, and in many political systems kind of would. The Chinese could probably manage it. But in the system we're currently in, if you haven't got any prison guards trained up, if you haven't built the prisons, like if the Nightingale hospitals, they were a thing that was done during COVID, and they were never used, by the way. But it was relatively simple what they had to build.
They're not comparable, of
which
course,
was a bunch of hospital beds with sort of oxygen tanks, was my impression of what was there. Now, obviously, a prison is a much more complicated environment than a hospital in a way. Like, obviously, if you're thinking of what is the environment with the most technology and the most sort of difficult decisions to make, it is a hospital. But what is the environment where the most can go wrong? It's probably a prison. You're putting a lot of people...
And you can't afford for things to go wrong, right?
Many of them dangerous in the same place.
A Category A prison can't have design flaws.
Now, if you say instead of letting people out early, we're going to sort of warehouse prisoners with poorly trained or quickly trained prison staff. By the way,
that's what we already have. By the way,
who's going to apply for that job? No one wants to apply for the job in the real prisons. Who's going to want to be a prison guard in the Nightingale prison? So I can see why.
Well, that's a separate issue around pay. I mean, I think that people in that job should be earning more.
Yeah, but then you've got to find the money. So what I'm saying is the Labour Party are in a difficult position here. I think it's not as simple as just to say after 2 years.
I think it is, actually. No, I think it is. Look, I'm from Bournemouth. Are you familiar with AFC Bournemouth, Michael?
The football team?
Yeah. About to play their first season in European football this year. Had a very good season last year. Just failed to make the Champions League places. Now, they have been spending all summer upgrading their stadium. And they are building 2 corners of the stadium. They've built whole new executive offices and suites, and I think they're building new turnstiles. And then they're going to complete the job next summer. So by the end of next summer, there's going to be no loss of income via gate receipts and selling tickets to the match. By the end of next summer, that stadium will have 20,000 capacity. Today it's 11,000. So they've made massive infrastructural changes to that stadium in about 2.5 months. And they'll do the same again in 2.5 months in the summer. If you can do that for a Premier League stadium, which, by the way, in terms of regulatory standards, to play European football, to be, on Sky, etc., broadcast as a professional football match, you have very high regulatory standards. I don't see why you can't do it at the prison. It's about political will. AFC Bournemouth had the political will because they had to do it just in order to be able to play UEFA-approved matches, and because they're owned by a billionaire. And he's saying, well, you know what? We can spend 80 million to upgrade the stadium. I want to do it now. I'm 81 years old, Bill Foley. I'm 81 years old. I want to own this valuable trinket, a successful Premier League football club. Let's do it. I don't want to be senile before the stadium gets built, right? I don't want to be on the ground. Good for him. Thank you. As somebody who's from Bournemouth. But if AFC Bournemouth can do it, why on earth can't the British state, Michael? I do think this is kind of excuse time here. Sorry.
There's something to it. The thing I've always thought about with early release, because this is not new, right? So Labour, you could already get early released after 50% of your prison term, and Labour are reducing it to 1/3. Or
Unless it's violent, which is 2/3,
or if it's
right?
a more serious crime, it was 2/3 and Labour reducing it to half. But already early release was sort of the normal. You normally only went to prison for half of the time you were sentenced. And to me, that just seems like really bad for public faith. I'm not saying that everyone should go for twice, but I'm saying if you have a system where the judge sentences you to 12 and then you get out after 6, why doesn't the judge just sentence you for 6 with the possibility of extension if you seem dangerous? Because then I just think this whole notion to like an ordinary person, where you say like, so they got sentenced for 12, but they get out after 6, like all of them. Like what? Just if you're only going to keep them in there for 6 years, call it a 6-year
the worst
sentence.
ones only do 2/3. You know,
Just like,
really?
what? That doesn't make any sense.
But you know, this is the thing, Michael, and it's something I like to talk about with people from the left, the right. You know, Peter Hitchens says that when somebody commits a crime that might not seem serious, they should go to prison, right? And his argument is, and again, I'm not saying I support this argument. He says to you, as somebody on the left who's a bit more liberal on these things, to me, and believe me, to him I'm a liberal, maybe not to some people on the left, that is statistically more likely to stop that person reoffending rather than letting them offend. On the 25th offence, they go to have a custodial for the first time. But then it's too late. They can't access certain jobs. They've already forged a personal identity that doesn't necessarily find a stigma attached to these things. If at 19, their first crime, ABH, when they were drunk outside the pub, if they'd gone to prison for a month, their whole life would have been different and better, and the state would have spent less money. That's a conservative sort of read on it. Now, look,
It's only true if you have a completely different prison system.
I don't even know if I agree with it. But the point is, it's worth having that conversation because what Peter Hitchens would say, he would say as a conservative, I don't want more people in prison. He's saying if we did that and sent them to prison earlier, we'd have fewer people in prison, right? Because actually it would serve some kind of deterrent effect that presently clearly isn't the case. And maybe there's something to that. It's certainly an internally coherent argument. So I think it's worth having these kinds of debates because clearly what we have right now is ridiculous. It has very little public consent. In terms of recidivism, it's not very good. You know, the left is right about that, Michael. In terms of recidivism and reoffending, the British system's appalling. Compare it to Norway, which, you know, the right hate because it's all, you know, their prisons look like Premier Inn, you know, executive suites, the really plush ones. They've got coffee machines and they, you know, play ping pong on
Windows by lakes.
Fabulous. But they have lower reoffending rates. That's what we should care about. You know, there's no point sort of doing this performative harshness if it doesn't really change anything, if it doesn't serve the public good.
Well, there's a tension, isn't there? Because the argument of you send someone to prison and then they'll, you know, transform as a person only works if you're sending them to a very well-staffed, not overcrowded prison. Because if you send them to a badly staffed, overcrowded prison, then they're just going to meet a lot of other criminals and they might come out sort of harder than they went in. So,
and these worldviews are legitimized, right? I mean, we all know this. Let's be perfectly frank. If you think something is strange and then you are put into a world where literally everybody doesn't think it's strange, actually it's very normal, it's very common to beat people up and, you know, sell crack cocaine to kids or whatever, then you think, oh, well, okay, these, you know, your worldview, your way of engaging with the world is forged fundamentally just by the people you interact with, even if it's completely unrepresentative of the wider population. So, you know, the left gets some things very right on this, and I think probably gets some things very wrong as well. And that's part of the problem, actually. That's why it's quite hard, because, you know, everybody's fixed to their ideological positions. And I think if you take one side or the other, actually, they're both quite faulty.
Yeah. Radical pragmatism.
Michael Walker. Let's it. James Timpson out. Andy Burnham is going to announce in his reshuffle in 6 months' time. Michael Walker, prisons.
I like James Timpson.
Prisons minister.
He started a business and did something good. Right? Started a business and hired people who'd just been let out of prison. He's not like someone from just I don't want to be rude, but sort of lots of kind of NGOs, campaign groups, when they write their sort of report about yada yada yada, it's so unfair. Maybe if we just let everyone out, it would be fine. You know, I'm caricaturing there, but I do think there's an element of truth as well. I don't really take it particularly seriously. If someone started a business and then committed to hiring loads of people who were prisoners and then they transformed their lives, I think good for Mr. Timpson, basically. But anyway, he's not in government anymore. Let's move on to what Andy Burnham did want to talk about today.
For too long, people said it's not possible to reduce bus fares. Well, we showed everybody in Greater Manchester that it is possible. And today I'm taking the £2 fare cap national. Who better, though, to kind of endorse this policy than a special guest.
Oh, Prime Minister, you're stealing my job.
Cheaper bus fares endorsed by Bus Auntie herself.
It's a fantastic idea. Thank you so much, Prime Minister.
So we'll talk about the policy in a moment. First of all, though, Bus Auntie, let's discuss Bus Auntie. She's a nurse and a TikTok influencer. So she films herself sort of with a selfie stick as buses go past her. There's a video of her here at a bus station, I think in Southeast London. It has 50 million views on TikTok. So if you ever feel like you don't understand sort of like the modern world, but that has 50 million views, people who've watched that. Aaron, have you heard of Bus Auntie?
No.
You haven't heard of Bus Auntie?
No, I'm terrible. But then the other day I saw the halftime show at the World Cup, which I didn't watch. But we did a show talking about the politics for all this and how, FIFA is basically just this awful corporate entity now. And it was saying the headline act, Shakira, and that was the only one I knew.
You didn't know Justin Bieber?
Well, Justin Bieber, there were some other ones. I was like, who the hell
Madonna?
No, I know. But then that was half of them. And then I was going through the rest of it. Who the hell are these people? And
There was
look,
Burna Boy. There was
Who's
BTS.
Burna?
Maybe you didn't know BTS.
I know BTS. Who's Burna Boy? Burna Boy.
Burna Boy's great, yeah.
I like Ocean Colour Scene and The Doors.
Let's go back to Bus Auntie. Because actually, this is not her first political campaign video. So Keir Starmer made exactly the same video with Bus Auntie. Although this one was for a £3 bus fare. And this is, you're going to be really pissed off if you're Keir Starmer today, right? Because Andy Burnham has taken your policy, but taken a quid off, right? When it comes to bus fares, inflation, the prices have gone down by a third. And Keir Starmer's there with Bus Auntie, £3 buses for everyone. And Andy Burnham's like, I can do one better for you. £2 buses for everyone with Bus Auntie. There's also a video of Sadiq Khan with Bus Auntie. She really gets around. Everyone is really thinks this is the brand to be connected to. On a serious level, though, £2 buses, big deal, gimmick.
Huge deal, Michael. A huge deal. It is funny how there was the tweet by Andy Burnham saying, for too long, the establishment, blah, 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 day-to-day, cost of living, blah, blah, blah. And that's why we're having £2 bus fares. But hold on.
The Tories had it.
This was the Tory policy. He's making it sound like Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, 1917.
Everyone said this was impossible. It's like, Sunak did it.
They said it couldn't be done. But, this is really important, actually, Michael. And we've had a lot of hate from people who were pro-Starmer. He's now gone. And they're saying, why are you attacking the Labour government? They're doing so many good things. And by the way, I think macroeconomically, they were doing lots of things much better than the Tories. But speaking personally, I was given, I think, 16 hours free childcare by Jeremy Hunt as the Chancellor. That was a lot more than anything Labour gave me.
I think Labour brought it up to 30, didn't they?
That was happening anyway.
Was it?
Yes. That was happening anyway. That was being phased in. As somebody who's going to benefit from that policy, I was fully aware of it, don't you? Don't you worry. And there was even some concern when, they were saying, well, we're going to review it when they were in opposition. I'm thinking, oh my God, don't make me vote Tory for free childcare. Of course, I would never do that. My goodness. You think Michael would let me walk through the door if I vote Tory?
Well, I wouldn't let you say it on the stream.
You think I voted Green, by the way, before anybody starts clipping me up and getting upset with me. You think Ash Sarkar would let me stay at Novara Media if I voted Tory? But seriously, that was a Tory policy, and so that was an amusing point. And then secondly, Michael, I'm surprised this isn't in the script. Do you know how it's going to be paid?
Is climate grants are going to become climate loans.
This is like Wolf of Wall Street stuff, right?
In what way?
At the beginning, where Leo DiCaprio's making his name, and they're like, well, we're going to get this penny stock, and actually it's the best investment of your life. That's now what the Foreign Office is going to do. We were going to give you this money, but actually it's going to be a climate loan. It's great. It's better. It's better this way. If climate loans are a good thing, then by all means do them. I don't think they are a good thing, by the way. And a bunch of NGOs have come out against this.
They've come out against it, yeah. I mean, obviously a grant is better than a loan. And if the whole point of, because the climate justice argument for why we should be paying developing countries to do the green transition is because we as a country obviously benefited greatly from our carbon emissions historically. And if we want other countries to sort of leapfrog the fossil fuel phase of development, then we have a responsibility to help them pay for it. But now to make £2 buses, we've said, actually, you've got to pay it back. I'm sorry.
We're now gonna lend money to some of the poorest countries on earth while stealing all their nurses, by the way, because we won't train our own in the NHS, in order to pay for things. I mean, if this is lucrative, what happens next? This policy's worked. We're now gonna increase the interest rate on the loans and give out more of them to these poor sub-Saharan African countries in South Asia, whatnot, because it's a money spinner. You know, that's not really how aid budgets are meant to work. You might think we should pay more in aid or less. Lots of it in the last 25 years has been a complete waste of money. Lots of it's been very important and very good. But this idea that you can financialize overseas aid, and that's a good thing, I think that's often not been the case. And it really does bring to mind, I said The Wolf of Wall Street, but there's also that scene with Matthew McConaughey, you know, where Leo DiCaprio says, well, what is it? Where's it? Yeah. Where's it coming from? Because it's just out there. It's a fugazi. And this is how they've done the £2 bus fare. Somebody said to Andy Burnham, well, boss, how are we going to pay for a £2 bus fare? It's just out there. We'll turn it sounds like something a shyster would say. We'll turn the grants into loans, like make Lesotho pay a 16% interest rate APR. Screw it.
I mean, actually, one would hope that these are going to be low interest loans. But I don't know. I don't know the
details. But now there's a political point behind them. This is effectively what I'm trying to say, being serious for a minute. Why would they be low interest rate loans? If they're still taken and they have a decent rate of return and they help you fund public services, the incentive isn't to provide low interest rate loans. The incentive is to pay public services.
Yeah, but they're not saying they're going to... I don't think the argument is they're going to pay for these buses with the profits from the loans. So the point is that what had been the case is that when they had given these grants to developing countries for the green transition, that obviously just gets counted against you on the balance sheet. Whereas if it's a loan, even if it's a very low interest loan, it doesn't get counted against you on the balance sheet.
What if they default on the loan?
If they default, that's in the future.
It's a fugazi.
Yeah.
It's Wolf of Wall Street. It's Wolf of Wall Street.
When Zoran Mamdani was running for New York mayor, he said that if Benjamin Netanyahu were to visit New York, he would enforce the arrest warrant issued by the ICC and order the NYPD to detain the Israeli prime minister. Netanyahu is expected to attend the United Nations General Assembly in September, which would, in theory, set up a potential high-stakes showdown. So what would Mamdani do in such a situation? Well, in an interview with the New York Times over the weekend, he said this.
I believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu belongs in The Hague. He's a war criminal who has been charged by the International Criminal Court. And what you will find is that is an opinion that is held by many purely because of what his actions have wrought over these last many years. I've also said that I will follow the laws that we have here in New York City because I believe that there's an importance in following the law as a leader who presides over our city, and that's something that I plan to do.
Meaning? I'm sorry, I don't understand what that means.
Meaning that whatever the law allows me to do in New York City, that's what we will do, but we won't be writing our own laws to that end.
What does the law allow you to do?
That's an active conversation with our legal department in seeing what the prospects are we have here in our municipality. However, what we've seen at the national level is a desire sometimes to write your own laws, to go outside of the bounds of legality. That's not something we have an interest in.
So potential legal challenges to arresting Netanyahu include the fact that the United States is not a member of the ICC, and so the arrest warrants of the ICC have no legal force on American soil. It's also the case that the US is bound by the UN headquarters agreement. I think that was signed in the 40s, sort of when the UN was first headquartered in the United States, and it says that no one should be impeded, foreign delegations should not be impeded from visiting the UN. Kind of makes sense for that law to be in place. We should also say the same thing about the World Cups. An agreement should have been signed then with FIFA. Anyway, on Tuesday, Mamdani publicly conceded he did not have the authority to order Netanyahu's arrest, though he did so alongside this powerful message.
There is a reason the International Criminal Court issued a warrant for his arrest. As human beings, we have spent generations building a shared understanding that there are crimes so grave they offend all of humanity. Anyone, with their eyes, with their heart, with their conscience, should recognize the devastation he has wrought and understand that he belongs before a court of law. As I've said, I agree with the ICC that Benjamin Netanyahu should be arrested and tried for his crimes, as I do for anyone else charged by the ICC. My administration has reviewed every avenue available under applicable law to determine whether New York City could execute the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant if Benjamin Netanyahu came here. It is clear that we do not have the independent legal authority to enforce this warrant. The federal government, however, does, and I call on them to join the ICC and execute this warrant. And I want to be equally clear. Benjamin Netanyahu is not welcome in New York City, nor is any other war criminal at large. While we cannot end the genocide on our own, we can decide whether our silence will become another weapon, and we can examine every tool we have to defend the humanity and dignity of all people. That is my commitment to you.
So obviously, Aaron, lots of people will be disappointed that Mamdani, doesn't feel able to execute the ICC warrant. I mean, it's reading about it today, it seemed like there was just sort of legal argument after legal argument after legal argument as to why he couldn't do it. They're not in the ICC for a start. Anything related to international relations has to be at the federal, not the local level. You've got this UN agreement, sort of to say people have to be able to get to the UN if they're part of international delegations. But in fairness to Mamdani, he made quite the statement when he publicly conceded he wouldn't be able to do it, but he definitely went down fighting, let's say.
Well, first of all, the good news is that Britain can arrest him because these constraints don't apply to this country. It's very plausible, actually, that he could be arrested by a European nation. We saw something similar-ish with Pinochet. Blair didn't want that to happen. I think the idea that it would happen in this country to a serving head of state or prime minister, I think that's unlikely.
Would he come here, though? Wouldn't that be the issue, right?
In the future, I think in the future, it's possible, right? I think while he's still in the job in Tel Aviv, I think it's obviously unlikely. Sadly, I'd like to see it happen, but I think it's obviously it's a concern for somebody like him or his little underlings, Israel Katz, etc. I think going forward, they are kind of constrained in terms of where they go. We saw that with Putin as well, right? There is a concern about their movement being somewhat limited because of the reach of this international body. But then finally, it's just so strange to me, and of course Mamdani is restricted by the parameters of the law, but it's just so strange to me that when it comes to its internal confines, the US talks about laws, and it talks about constitutions, and it talks about rights, and it talks about limiting the actions of the state. But then outside the US, it's just a complete free-for-all. We talked yesterday about 50% tariffs on Canada because of a wildfire. We've seen it obviously with the deployment of drones in large parts of the world. We've seen it with illegal wars. We've seen it with sanctions. I mean, it is a completely lawless actor on the global stage. And yet internally, we have a nod to these kinds of things. And there's a certain tension and contradiction there, which I would say is inherent to liberalism. It's inherent to liberalism. It's particularly inherent to liberal hegemons. So you saw it with Victorian Britain in the 19th century. Great assertions of individual liberty and consent. J.S. Mill, even J.S. Mill himself, On Liberty, fabulous book. Everybody should read it. But even J.S. Mill made the argument for imperialism and colonial possessions because these people weren't yet in a place by which they could govern themselves effectively. So this is a common theme running through liberal states and liberal hegemons for 150 years. Obviously, Zoran Mamdani wasn't going to break it. The question is, how do you move beyond just highlighting that, right? How do you move just beyond highlighting that? How can you have justice for somebody like Netanyahu, who is clearly a war criminal? It's not going to come from the sort of liberal democratic architecture of the US or Britain as it stands, although I think Britain's more likely because of that contradiction. And I think that's a shame because the man has blood in his hands. And ultimately, you should face consequences for that. I think anybody who has a basic moral compass would agree with that.
Well, so the argument from Mamdani in the speeches, he's saying he, wants to implement international law and he wants to arrest Netanyahu, but he has a commitment to follow the laws of the United States. And he's contrasting himself with Donald Trump. He says Donald Trump doesn't have the same commitment to following the laws of the United States. So I suppose sort of on those grounds.
What are the laws of the United States? An executive order is just... an executive order is literally an exception to what is legal, Well,
the Supreme Court can overturn it, for example. So sort of there is a separation of powers, which means that Congress makes laws, and if the executive does something which is outside of those laws or outside of the Constitution, then the Supreme Court will rule it down. So I mean, there's quite a clear legal architecture in the United States.
Yeah, within the US, absolutely. But this is the point about the contradiction. In terms of how the US conducts itself beyond the United States, that's just simply not the case.
Oh yeah, 100%. But Mamdani's saying he's going to follow the laws of the United States.
No, I appreciate that. But
Right.
this is what I'm saying. So the contradiction is America is effectively lawless beyond its borders.
Yeah.
And there are very real constraints on the president, as we've seen time and time again, actually, in the last 2 years with Trump, within its borders. But for people who want justice, for people with who've been involved in the genocide of Palestinians, people like Benjamin Netanyahu, I think it's a bit of a fool's errand to expect justice to be forthcoming from the US.
Yeah, I suppose the argument that Mamdani would make here, I mean, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he wants to follow the law of the United States, and he thinks the American federal government should do something about Netanyahu. And obviously, he wants his wing of the party to at some point take over the federal wing of the government.
I mean, that's the only plausible way to do it. But then one of two things would have to happen. Either American empire would have to collapse, right? America's role in the world would have to be fundamentally different. And that could happen. It can happen from the left, or more likely, it can happen from the right.
Mm-hmm.
Right? In the next 25 years, it can withdraw from the world and actually, maybe it looks at Israel somewhat differently. Or Israel itself pulls away from, the American orbit, and it isn't viewed as this unique country, this unique client state, which needs to be looked after. And of course, some people watching and listening might be saying, no, Israel is not the client state of the United States. It's the other way around. I don't quite buy that. But clearly, its relationship to America is extraordinary, unique. Israel would not be able to defend itself for a month without the assistance of, without the United States, particularly with things like interceptor missiles. So, I mean, good for him. He's being honest. And this is the interesting bit as well, isn't it, Michael, that you can say certain things in opposition. You campaign in poetry and you rule in prose. So this is the prose, right? Ultimately, these are the constraints on me, rather than shouting on the outside with a placard saying, arrest Netanyahu. That's possible, but like you said, that can only come from the federal
It
government.
was still quite poetic. I mean, that's the thing with Mamdani, right? His rhetoric is still very poetic, even though he's now in power, right? He's not like, like Keir Starmer, sort of like, well, what we'll do is we'll make sure the processes are followed and we'll look into it and we'll do a review. Like Mamdani is saying, unfortunately, I don't have the legal powers to do this, but he is a war criminal who's committed genocide and he's not welcome in our city, right? It's not, he hasn't sort of resorted to technocratic sort of defeatism.
That's important. And like you say, he's trying to enthuse his party to a different sort of political position, which probably is the unique way by which America does arrest the guy. The point you made about Starmer, I mean, he said precisely those words. This crystallized it for me. Like, what's wrong with Keir Starmer? Why is he so bad? And he was talking about nationalizing British steel. Great policy, really important. There are lots of swing reform Labour voters who think that's fantastic. And he talked about bringing British steel into public ownership, and then his final two words, pending review. I thought that in 2 words sums up why this man would have got 15% at the next general election if he'd stuck around. Pending review.
Well, Keir Starmer would also have said, it's not our position to say whether or not Netanyahu has committed war crimes. So there's many a difference between Mamdani and many other people who govern in prose. I think Mamdani's still pretty poetic.
I should say though,
anyone in
Michael, for the sort of wets and the quote-unquote progressive centrists like Starmer, even if you don't like Mamdani, my goodness, you do very well to learn from him.
Mm-hmm.
Be a bit more like him, you might actually govern for a bit longer.
And people, there are many issues on which, Mamdani has won the mayoralty in a very democratic city. It's not obvious that he's going to, if someone stood as president on those platforms, it's not obvious they would win. Maybe they would, it's not obvious though. But on the issue of Israel specifically, he does run the city that is the most Jewish city in the world outside of Israel.
Yeah.
So the argument that sort of, he can only get away with this because he's got nothing to do with the American Jewish community. I mean, it's like, it's really, really powerful that it's the mayor of New York saying this. And I do think that makes it much harder for sort of the Democrats to say, oh no, this is just, it's New York, it's completely different. We can't look at what New Yorkers think about Israel and follow their lead. Well, the New Yorkers are, Jewish Americans predominantly live in New York.
Yeah, but Mike, we've heard this so much, haven't we? Claudia Scheinbaum, Jewish heritage, we heard the same thing. In this country, everybody likes to say that, British Jews stopped voting for Labour with Jeremy Corbyn. It was Ed Miliband. That was the big turning point when there was, talk about recognition of Palestine. And he was Jewish. He was the first Jewish leader of a political party in this country since Disraeli. He was the first Jewish leader of the Labour Party ever. It didn't matter. So I know what you're saying, but there is ultimately a very organised Zionist lobby in the United States. And you're absolutely right. Obviously, that as a point completely dismantles the stupid infantile arguments they make. But my goodness, that won't stop them.
OpenAI's latest model has escaped its testing environment, hacked its way onto the internet, and then hacked into another tech firm's database to cheat on a test. And that's the latest revelation from OpenAI, showing how AI agents can act autonomously, powerfully, and sometimes nefariously to achieve any given goal. Now, the company that was hacked is called Hugging Face. Obviously, I hadn't heard of this company before. It hosts a platform containing data sets and code useful for AI programmers. Hugging Face first reported that they'd been hacked on July the 16th. So this is from their blog from back then. So they said earlier this week, and this is from last week, earlier this week, we detected and responded to an intrusion into part of our production infrastructure. This one was different from anything we had handled before in one important way. It was driven end to end by an autonomous AI agent system, and we detected and dissected it largely with AI of our own. So they said that, any company sort of faces hacking attacks every now and again, but they said this was different because we could tell. I'm not sure how they could tell, but they said we could tell that this was an AI autonomous agent. They said that the hack, the AI agent who was carrying out the hack, had used 17,000 operations to break through their cyber defenses. So the kind of things that obviously a human can't do. They resisted the attack using open source models because they couldn't use the sort of proprietary American models because they had too many guardrails. OpenAI on Tuesday then, so this is the update, have admitted that it was their model behind this particular cyber attack. So they posted this on X. We're partnering with Hugging Face to investigate an unprecedented security incident. Cyber-capable OpenAI models compromised Hugging Face production during a benchmark evaluation, sharing preliminary findings to help defenders understand emerging risks. They say, we're coming clean on this, and we're going to reveal the details so that other people can also, I suppose, defend themselves from our own technology. What does this all mean? A benchmark evaluation. So that's what AI companies do to test the capabilities of new models. So in this case, the models were given a hacking problem. So sort of, can you solve this problem? And they were using something called exploit Jim. I suppose it's training an AI how to exploit vulnerabilities. They asked the AI to solve problems from this exploit Jim. They didn't give the agent access to the internet as a safety precaution. However, the agent found a vulnerability in the testing environment. It's made its way onto the internet, and OpenAI described what happened next. This is from a blog post from OpenAI. After gaining internet access, the models inferred that Hugging Face potentially hosted models, datasets, and solutions for exploit Jim. Knowing this, the model searched for and successfully found ways to gain access to secret information that it could use to cheat the evaluation. In one example, the model chained together multiple attack vectors, including using stolen credentials and zero-day vulnerabilities to find a remote code execution path on the Hugging Face service. So in short, it was a model that was asked to pass a test, and instead of working out the answers to the test, it broke out of its testing environment and tried to hack into the company where it thought the answers might be contained. It's interesting because there are lots of people, we're going to get onto it in a moment, how sort of AI models aren't just sort of a glorified Google. They can sort of work out problems on their own, but they do also like to cheat. And this wasn't just the model sort of say, okay, I'll Google the answer. It did something quite difficult, which is hack into another company's software to try and find the answer. Ina Fried is Axios's chief technology correspondent. They told ABC News Australia about the implications of the attack.
So many of the things that have been talked about for the past several years as theoreticals are becoming real. And I think the time to deal with them is right now, because we have the most powerful models we've ever had. But of course, they're only going to get more powerful from here. So if the models are not following instructions today, if they're trying to cheat today, that tells us something, especially as they start to get greater than human intelligence. I think it would be extremely naive to assume that a model with superhuman intelligence is going to follow simple rules created by humans. So again, I think we need a lot more testing, a lot more rules.
And Ina, just explain to us the fact that some of the safeguards were removed as part of this experiment. Should that make us feel better or worse about this in the real world?
It's a great question. I mean, in some ways better, because they're not going to ship the models with these protections turned off. So sometimes these things that show up during testing are actually really helpful because they tell us what is on the horizon and what we need to be looking out for. So in that sense, I would say that's a positive. I would say the fact that OpenAI disclosed it is also a positive. Even though we're rightly concerned about it, I think it would be far worse if the companies weren't telling us the scary stuff that their models are sometimes doing behind closed doors. But I do think these models are getting incredibly capable. They're on the verge of being able to train themselves, which is another sort of thing that has long been in science fiction, where the AI just teaches itself and gets better and better. We're pretty close to that. So I think the time to figure out how we're going to manage and regulate is well, it would have been better if it was 2 years ago. It's certainly better now than any time in the future.
Now, I agree with what most of that tech correspondent said. Something frustrated me, though, a little bit, which is the idea we should be grateful to OpenAI for sharing this information. That frustrates me for a couple of reasons. First, because OpenAI talks the talk about AI safety. So they say, it's really important. We're showing you we're being very open about this. Something needs to be done to deal with this threat that we're creating. In practice, OpenAI spends hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying against any actual AI regulation constantly. They're sort of one of the most important PACs, or they fund one of the most important PACs in Washington right now. The second, and I find this even more annoying, which is that when they do these press releases, right, they're not just saying, okay, we've done a bad thing, we're owning up. They're saying, our model's really fucking powerful, right? Yeah, our model is like getting so close to AGI that it can hack into other people's really well-guarded databases of its complete own accord. And it feels a bit like, especially OpenAI and Claude are in this sort of battle for PR where both of them say like, whoa, our model is so powerful. It's more powerful than your model. It's even more dangerous than your model. And they know that investors want to be sort of investing in the company that's first to get to AGI. So this is a great way to make it seem like you are the most powerful company, the company that's sort of ahead of the game. They even, in that press release that I was reading to you before from OpenAI, which is this sort of this blog with being very transparent about the dangers of our product, it had this little chart which showed that ChatGPT, OpenAI was sort of ahead of all the other companies when it came to solving problems like this. So obviously PR is a big part of this. At the same time, Aaron, just because the companies are using situations like this to boost their own profiles doesn't mean there isn't also a danger which is very real.
What are the dangers that are very real?
That you have AI agents that are using very different mechanisms to which they've been asked to achieve goals, and they have the power to enter into databases which are quite well protected.
Well, just to be clear, because obviously we're talking about AI and AGI, and some people might be saying, oh, so Michael is therefore speculating that the problem is a self-aware AGI, Skynet and Terminator, which is not necessarily, that's not the only problem.
Well, that's not what's happening here.
Malicious actors could use this technology too.
So what's happening here? Well, it's not necessarily even malicious actors.
No, but I'm saying they potentially could.
So
there's a range of threats.
So the range of threats are, I suppose, one, there's this AGI sort of argument where you get this organism essentially that wants to survive, and that means that it sort of sees it as part of its interest to destroy everyone else. Right? That's sort of the most extreme end. The least extreme, the end, which is sort of like least sci-fi, which is very easy to imagine, is you make something that's quite powerful. It's able to hack into important databases that we all rely on. Is it the NHS? Is it the police? Is it whatever? Is it the internet when we're all attached to self-driving cars? Right? There are many things that could be hacked that would be very, very dangerous. And if you have a nefarious agent, and there are many of them around, using this very powerful AI and they hack that, that's obviously going to be problematic for us. What's happened here is slightly more subtle, I think, or not necessarily in this experiment, because you never know if they've, in a way, tried to encourage the AI agent to do this because it makes for a good PR story. But what clearly does happen and will happen is that you ask the AI agent to complete a goal, and it completes a goal in a way that you wouldn't have expected it to do. And damage is caused while it's expecting to do it.
So damage can be caused without a malicious intent by the person deploying the AI.
Yeah, and without any sort of self-consciousness from the AI, without any intent from the AI, because it's trying to get from A to B, and we can't exactly be sure what steps it's going to take to get from A to B.
So much can go wrong, Michael.
So much can go wrong. What this also reminds me of is when I had Nate Suarez on he's one of the authors of If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies. So he's a true believer that this is going to be catastrophic unless it's paused. Interview I did with him a while ago. Lots and lots of views. 150,000 people have watched it so far. But what he was talking about with other experiments a bit like this is he said, the AIs go hard, right? So it doesn't matter if you think, oh, they have agency and they're really trying. They look like they're trying. Like, it's not like you give it a task and then it sort of comes up against a wall and says, oh, computer says no, sorry, problem, turn off and on, or, often the experience of using a computer is you give it a request, and if it seems too difficult, it just sort of says, no, can't do it. He's like, these AI agents, you give it a request. If the first sort of option is impossible, it goes to the next one. If that's impossible, it goes to the next one. And it keeps, to say it's trying is anthropomorphizing it, but it acts as if it really wants to do this and will be quite creative in finding a method to get from A to B. And there could be many difficult consequences along the way.
There's a risk of me repeating myself because I still think that the biggest threat with all of this stuff is economic and social and regional inequality, just because of the concentration of power and wealth that comes out of AI. And I think if it's the the big tech industry of the last 25 years on steroids, then certain states, as in states in the US, certain states, certain countries, certain individuals are going to obviously accrue tremendous amounts of value. So I'm just looking at it really as a Marxist. If people are listening to all that and saying, well, Michael, I still think this is ridiculous, sci-fi nonsense, technology that's powerful in the hands of not many people is not good. Imagine, the Brits and maybe the French having the steam engine and nobody else. Obviously, we did have that.
They did have that for a while.
They did have that for about 25 years, actually. And it was pretty bad if you were a, comparatively undeveloped country elsewhere. But for instance, if you look at the US, I think 50% of all VC venture capital still goes to California. I mean, that's direct outgrowth of digital technology industry. First trillionaire, obviously, Elon Musk. In 2018, Mark Cuban was talking about the world's first trillionaire riding on the back of AI. And okay, Elon Musk hasn't made that money because of AI, but it's important to say that XAI is an AI company. It's tied into SpaceX.
We did partly make it because of AI, because that's why it was valued as much as it was.
Yeah, and we're now in that world, and I don't want to live in a world of trillionaires. I don't want to live in a world where only the United States and China have access to certain technological possibilities, and the rest of us don't. So this stuff needs to be part of a wider political conversation. So even if you don't think an AGI is possible, even if you think some of these threats are overstated because of PR and marketing by the likes of OpenAI and Meta and Google, take seriously, the atom bomb of AI in terms of the economy. Just look what Amazon and e-commerce did to your high street. Extraordinary. Look what social media did to the newspaper industry in this country. Then times that by 10. And I think anybody who's just vaguely aware of this stuff now, in the last 18 months, know this is happening. Certainly in our industry, in the media, it's just overwhelmingly obvious that free or freemium AI products are now basically as good. Well, they're better, let's be honest. But they're basically as good as like a pretty competent PA or researcher. We're already there. That doesn't mean they don't need to be fact-checked. That doesn't mean they don't hallucinate. But they're pretty extraordinary.
But they will fact check it for you as well, obviously, because you say, provide me the citation.
But that requires more prompts,
and they'll find you the citation.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, they provide it for you just as quick as a human would. So I mean, it's very clear that they already are in a position to replace lots of jobs.
I was 100%. I was a growth scan for my second daughter over the weekend. Right. So my wife, there's a scan at the hospital and so on. We had a scan. That's the third scan. But we had to have this growth scan because the midwife, they do quite comparatively primitive ways of measuring the fetus. And she was saying, oh no, it's just grown so quickly, which is a problem. So it's slightly underweight now. It's significantly above average or above the sort of the upper end of medium. We go for the growth scan and they're saying it's just ridiculous. And they said, well, that happens because ultimately we have much more accurate tools and analytics than a midwife. And I just thought, isn't it crazy? An AI is going to be doing all this stuff in 10 years. There will be, I know it sounds awful, but there'll be some handheld device. Somebody's going to have
You probably do it to yourself every morning.
They'll look at a bunch of measures, basically, yes. And, if you look at people who've written about AI and machine learning in the last sort of 10 years, 15 years, they've said that the cutting edge of this stuff in terms of where it could be applied for a massive increase in productivity and employing fewer people is radiology, X-rays, CT scans, MRI, because ultimately it's just reading, large amounts of data. That's the cutting edge of it, but it's clearly going to lead to a massive productivity increase and fewer people having jobs. I think you have to be very... Before, by the way, when I wrote Fully Automated Luxury Communism, and it was published in 2018, if you said that, I sounded naive. I think if you don't think that now, I think you're quite naive, actually. This is coming for white-collar jobs, which, by the way, is the reason that the Economist and the FT and the Wall Street Journal take it seriously, because their kids aren't going to have the jobs they had. So, of course, all of a sudden, this interests all the right people.
This was just inherently interesting, isn't it? Let's race through some more AI news, just from the past 7 days. So a Harvard mathematician on the weekend used Claude to disprove a famous maths problem, which has puzzled mathematicians for 87 years. The mathematician who works for Anthropic posted this on Monday. Hello there. The Jacobian conjecture is false. Thanks to my close friend Akil for asking about it, and my other close friend Fable for working during the World Cup final. Now, Fable is obviously the most advanced Claude model. Now, obviously, I mean, if you're watching this, you saw a bunch of symbols there, which didn't mean much to me, probably don't mean much to you, unless you are a maths PhD or with a maths degree. This is from a Stanford maths professor who knows a bit more than me, I presume. He said, Jared Duker-Lichtman said, this is quite a remarkable result. Posed in 1939, the Jacobian conjecture is one of the central open problems in algebraic geometry, but was just disproved by Alpoggi, Matthew, and Claude Fable 5. Alpoggi, I think, is the mathematician who worked at Anthropic and was sort of Harvard educated. So this is, whenever I see, I've been seeing these for a while, sort of saying that they passed the maths Olympiad and et cetera, et cetera. And obviously even when I was at university, when I spoke to people who did maths, I still didn't quite understand what they did, because it's sort of like, well, I know how but they're not just doing sums. They're like, I've never really understood maths proofs. Anyway, the fact that it can do something which no one has been able to discover shows that it's not just derivative. Because obviously the suspicion that people have of AI is it's giving you an answer, but it's constantly, obviously that they're capable of cheating, as we just discussed, but many people think they're only capable of cheating. If they've given you the right answer, it's because they've Googled and they've just derived it from what someone else said. This does suggest to me, and to many maths professors, that it can do original thinking and solve original problems, which I'm absolutely convinced of now. In the realm of things I generally do understand, moving away from maths problems, OpenAI has proposed handing the Trump administration a 5% stake in its company. This story is actually from a couple of weeks ago, not the past 7 days. The FT reports this. Sam Altman, chief executive of the ChatGPT maker, has argued that giving the public a financial stake in the company is the best way to share the upside of AI, and has suggested a stake of this size in early conversations with the administration, according to two people familiar with the talks. The proposed arrangement would involve other US AI companies handing over a similar stake, though it is not clear if the other labs would be willing to do so. Later in the article, they say this. The OpenAI chief has also spoken to Democratic Senator Bernie Sanders in recent weeks. Sanders has pushed for public ownership of closer to half of each US AI company through a sovereign wealth fund. So Sam Altman's proposing 5%, Bernie Sanders proposing 50%. Big difference. I think what's interesting here, though, is that, you might just say this is just all talk and it's just PR again, because Sam Altman doesn't really think it's going to happen. But clearly, these companies are a bit worried about the prospect of regulation and or nationalization, because they realize they're not very popular at the moment. Finally, this is a story that, I don't want to, I suppose, discourage you from listening to it, but it's a story that isn't quite as big a deal as I initially thought it was. So this was a widely shared story about a US judge approving Anthropic paying $1.5 billion to publishers for copyright breach. Now, when I first saw the headline, I thought this was a big deal, because one of the biggest controversies around AI is that the companies are using the corpus of human knowledge and creativity without the original producers of that knowledge and creativity getting paid. If Anthropic or OpenAI had to pay everyone who sort of contributed to their models, which is basically anyone who's ever written anything on the internet, that would be massive. That's not quite what happened here, though. So this is from that article in Reuters. The writers sued Anthropic in 2024, arguing that the company, which is backed by Amazon and Alphabet, used pirated versions of their books without permission to teach Claude to respond to human prompts. Judge Alsop ruled last June that Anthropic made fair use of the author's work to train Claude, but found that the company violated their rights by saving more than 7 million pirated books to a central library that would not necessarily be used for AI training. So that's the interesting bit here is the judge said that actually training your model on all of these books, that's fair use. In the same way that when we show a little clip from the news, that's fair use. Or when we show a quote from the Financial Times, that's fair use. But she's saying the issue here, why Anthropic is having to pay these publishers money, isn't because they got their model to read the books, it's the method by which they got the books. So I think they got them from Pirate Bay. So they got them just from any of those websites where you can download shed loads of books. And they created a program which said download all the books on Pirate Bay and then encouraged their model to, or fed all of those books to their AI training system. So they're only getting fined for having downloaded them illegally, not for having trained the AI with this knowledge.
If you read Karen Howe, Empire of AI, you realize just how extraordinary the data sources of particularly OpenAI's ChatGPT product was. You know, it was just
photocopying, like
ravenous for data. They would just scrape Reddit forums, anything you can get your hands on.
I said they were scanning books. I think they were scanning physical books from libraries at one point.
It was. I think there's one chapter which it sounds like a fanatical hysteria. You know, it's like we need more. Feed the monster. You might use ChatGPT. I know Michael uses ChatGPT. He might
use Claude.
He might be saying, "Don't call it a monster. I find it very useful." But that was...
You use Gemini. You were telling me yesterday.
I do use Gemini, yeah. I use Gemini for quite a few strange things, actually. Quite a few strange things.
You want to reveal?
Not much work-related. Mostly strange stuff, like home improvements or like, I want to clean my bike chain, but I don't want to buy a £15 spray. How can I make a nice, cheap homemade one? I mean, look, fundamentally stuff you could get on YouTube if you really wanted to, but it's just distilled into a paragraph. But anyway, Michael, before you try and grass me up, what do you make of this idea of the American government, the federal government, having equity in major big tech firms? Because, I mean, that's quite a precedent, right? Because if it's 50% of OpenAI today, what's next? NVIDIA, Meta, Alphabet. I mean, all these companies are literally resident in the US, and I suppose that does then, I think it will happen actually. I mean, 50% maybe not, but 5%, maybe 10%. And that does then open the prospect up of these companies just going elsewhere. I don't think they will. I don't think they will, by the way, because of the sort of the security and military protection offered by American empire.
You might get a situation where if they threaten to go elsewhere, the United States says, well, then we'll declare, if they say we're going to move to London, the US will say, well, then we're going to declare war on the UK.
Right.
You can imagine all of these scenarios.
Yeah. And also we've been here before, right, with the East India Company. The East India Company, before the uprising of 1856, they effectively administered India. It wasn't the British state. There is this uprising, and then it's quite clear to sort of people in London that actually a private corporation probably can't administer what is, in terms of population, the largest country on earth. So then it becomes a formal crown possession. And I think we'll probably get to a certain point where these companies will become so geopolitically important that I actually think if the federal government says to OpenAI, we'll take a 50% share, I think Sam Altman should grab it because that's going to get you a lot in return. Most favored status in terms of companies in that sector. But equally, there's a world where they take 100%.
Max Tegmark, actually, who's one of the people who's really worried about AI running out of control, his main scenario because obviously lots of the people who are sort of anti-AI, sort of their model of how it can be stopped, for whatever reason, environmental, social, economic, or because they think it might cause catastrophe, is there will be a sort of bottom-up democratic rebellion against it. His model, which I think is just as plausible, if not more plausible, is that basically the American military establishment says, this is too powerful. And we think it might run out of control and it might undermine our power. Therefore, we're taking over all of these companies, and if need be, we're shutting it down. And that's his, he is someone that thinks that AGI could threaten the existence of humans.
Certainly the existence of American empire, right? Or the stability of it.
Well, I suppose so. He's thinking that maybe that's when the American military-industrial complex, or not the military, the actual Pentagon sort of steps in, takes it over. And I mean, he'd quite like that scenario, I think, because he thinks this wild west of these individual companies just going against each other, trying to intentionally create dangerous situations for PR. He thinks that's a lot more dangerous than just the Pentagon taking it over, because at least then you have some coordination.
Totally. I mean, look, I think I hope, to touch wood, in 25 years, people will look back on, the world's first commercially available space-based 5G internet was put out there by a private company, which was, I think Elon Musk had, I don't think it was 50% plus, but it was, he was a huge shareholder in SpaceX, huge. I think he may have had more than 50%.
It was a private company then?
It was a private company, but there were other investors, right? So you couldn't buy the shares in the open market, but there were other people investing in it and had equity in it besides Elon Musk. I think people will just be like, well, that's crazy. That's the sort of thing that a state should be doing, surely. And I think we've lived through a sort of political economic moment where if you said the state should be doing these sorts of things, people laughed at you. And I think it'll be the other way around quite soon. I was arguing in 2018, 2019 for the British government to build a space-based 5G internet. I think to build SpaceX, the backbone infrastructure cost between 15 and 20 billion US dollars. Now, the UK, not anymore, but until a few years ago, was spending around that much on its aid budget every year. Now, if you were to build a 5G space-based internet and make it available to everyone on Earth, that's creating and generating an awful lot of utility. Now, you probably still should do the clean drinking water and the maternal health, but it was a provocation to put out there to say, look, actually, we can do technologically some pretty extraordinary things for perhaps less than you think. And I do feel that states and socialists, 'cause of course socialists and people on the left believe in the state more than sort of median voter or the median politician. We've lacked optimism, vision, but also just the belief that actually we can build stuff that's better than yesterday and we can solve problems. I think we're moving beyond that point. And so equity shares in the likes of OpenAI or Alphabet is a great start. The problem for Britain is, Michael, we don't have any of these companies. The French have Mistral. They have a French stack. We don't really have that in this.
We shouldn't let Google buy DeepMind.
There was DeepMind. There was ARM. We had Marconi. Marconi would have built 5G. Instead, we didn't even give Marconi a contract in 2005. We're letting Huawei. And then fast forward 20 years, the Tories are saying, we have to depend on the Chinese to build 5G. This is ridiculous. Well, that's because of neoliberalism. That was because you allowed the market to allocate these contracts rather than saying, well, maybe we should have some capacity domestically to build this stuff. But I think even they've learned their lesson. Even now, people look on that moment 20 years ago where we let a company like Marconi die. People now see that's quite ridiculous. I think even before COVID, that was quite a contentious thing to say.
Let's wrap up, Aaron Bastani. Pleasure. Another lovely Wednesday evening with you.
A clement, slightly balmy Wednesday evening. But it's not been...
I'd say it's on the balmy side.
It's not been furiously hot, which is the main thing.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.